and Democratic Minority Leader Senator Chuck Schumer. Well, for more on the Prime Minister's Washington trip, we are joined from New York by Eric Mandel, founder director of the Middle East Political and Information Network. And Eric, thanks for joining us. Before we start breaking down the specifics of some of these issues, I want to get an overall view, your overall view of the trip itself. Of course, for the Prime Minister Netanyahu, definitely a more positive trip than his last visit to Washington. No unpleasant surprises here. A real chemistry, it would seem, between him and President Trump. They're on the same page, it would seem. But some disappointment here in Israel that so far the trip hasn't produced a dramatic announcement, especially as regards to a hostage deal. So what's your overall view?
Prime Minister Netanyahu has basically made it very clear again and again that there's no daylight between President Trump and Israel, between the two of them, and that everything is coordinated, and that won't be a deal, at any price. That we want it desperately, but we're not going to give up everything. And when people really look at this, it's very difficult to see how this is going to work. Who has leverage? The only leverage, or the strongest leverage, is President Trump on Prime Minister Netanyahu. And President Trump thinks that Prime Minister Netanyahu owes him for Iran, and he knows that he can be fickle. And so right now everything looks good. This is an unprecedented kind of trip because they really didn't have all the photo ops that they normally have. They did this quietly, the negotiations. But when you look at it, how are you going to make all of this work? What are Israel's bottom red lines with Gaza? Now, publicly, Netanyahu says it is, I think one of the things not spoken about is the buffer zone, the 1 kilometer buffer zone that goes all around the Philadelphia corridor. But now you've gotten in the Moreg corridor, which is basically separating Khan Yunis from Rafah, that you can build a humanitarian city on the other side. But the north may be even more important. So I don't think President Trump wants to go into all these details, knowing that Bet Hanun may be more important than the Morag axis of what's going on. So what's going to come out of this is sooner or later President Trump wants a deal. How much will Bibi give up? And then when you take a step back and look at this from 30,000 feet, you're going to almost condemn the remaining 10 hostages because Hamas is not going to be disarmed. Who is going to disarm Hamas? There may be a fig leaf that they may leave Gaza, but sooner or later you're going to have some kind of deal at the very end. And so probably when you really look at this should be a deal of all the hostages now. I think most Israelis would like that kind of deal. It's the one that makes the most sense. But I don't think Prime Minister Netanyahu, to keep his coalition together, and you hate to say politics, could be involved with these hostages, cannot do that type of deal, which is what really needs to be done. And remember, President Trump also said that this is supposedly, that he's going to guarantee after the 60-day ceasefire that Israel's not going to restart military operations again. And then where are you? So, you throw out all this stuff, and really, what are you left at the end? You're going to get a deal, 60 days, but what about the final hostages? How do you get them out? How does Israel have security? I was with Southern Command about 2 months ago, and I asked them if you gave up that 1 kilometer buffer zone, could you ensure the safety of the people on the Gaza envelope? And he says, it's not that we couldn't ensure it, even though it would be incredibly difficult. He says, but they're going to see Palestinians, they're going to leave. And if Israel can't bring the communities home, whether in the north or the south, then this war is going to have a mixed result at the very end.
Right. And Eric, you've mentioned President Trump really clearly looking for a deal, or at least that 60-day ceasefire right now. He doesn't want to go into details, but some of those details that Israel has been talking about, the Morag corridor, establishing a humanitarian area in southern Gaza, while presumably the northern areas would be built, seem to fit in with what initially seemed to be the sort of Trump plan or Trump vision for the day after in Gaza. President Trump seems to have shifted focus away from that now. How do you read at least where the administration is standing on what a day after in Gaza would look like?
Well, I think one of the important things here is something that Israel hasn't done, and maybe is beginning to do now, and maybe too late, is how do you separate the population from Hamas fighters. By the way, we have to be honest here. The most of the Gazans, at least according to polls, are still with Hamas. This is a radicalized population. So setting it up and turning even humanitarian areas that aren't armed into places that are going to have a different mindset, a different educational system. It's going to be generations. This stuff isn't going to happen very quickly. So I think, I think expectations need to be managed here of what's going to come next in Gaza. And maybe it's time for Israel to take half a loaf here and maybe say, Hamas is going to be there. We need some fig leaves to be left over, but to get all the hostages out right now.
Well, you say a fig leaf, but presumably there's been talk about Israel making some kind of deal to end the war, but that would include maybe progress towards expanding the Abraham Accord, security alliances with at least with maybe countries like Saudi Arabia and Syria. Whether these are fig leaves or not, what would you see? What would it take for Israel? What would it be worth for Israel to get in order to agree to some kind of ceasefire where at least there were certainly parts of Gaza still either under Hamas control or certainly elements of Hamas still left in Gaza?
I think if Israel was able to keep its 1 kilometer buffer zone, keep the Philadelphia corridor, and got real normalization, Saudis are less to make a deal with Israel because Israel has, even though Israel is now the strong man after Iran, that's already done. Maybe they don't need to take a risk. I was in contact with the Saudis after October 7th, and they told me they didn't know how radicalized their population was against Israel. That tell you generations of education there that was not pro-Israel to say the least, even though they've made some reforms that are there. So maybe on Gaza, Israel will again take half loaf. When I was talking about some kind of fig leaf of Hamas saying they're going to be disarmed or that there is some withdrawal of some of their leaders. But if Hamas is standing with this final thing that Israel have to be removed from every centimeter of the Gaza Strip, that means the buffer zone, Philadelphia corridor, Morag in the north, and Hamas is not leaving disarmed. And again, practically, I don't even see how that's possible. Then what are you going to have at the end of the day here? But then again, this is also about politics. Prime Minister Netanyahu wants to keep his coalition together. The ceasefire, 60 days, we're just kicking the can a little bit down the road here. And that's a problem. That's a problem for the remaining hostages that are going to be there. And I think President Trump is going to lose patience with Israel if it restarts the war after 60 days. And again, one of the most important things in the Middle East here, everybody's kind of forgotten Iran. It's only a couple of weeks ago that Iran was going on.
Let me ask you about Iran, because obviously that was probably also major on the agenda. I should say that there are reports out of Israel today, Israeli sources saying they believe that uranium that was in Fordow was not removed, that actually was buried there at that site. But still, that leaves the question of if Iran starts to enrich again, who takes action against it? We've heard reports of the U.S. Supplying Israel with B-2 bombers. So how do you see that going forward? Who's going to have the responsibility to deal with Iran, for example, if it starts enrichment again?
Well, I think Israel's happy to enforce it on its own. The question is, will the president say that Israel, like it has in Lebanon now, has freedom of action to strike when either it begins its ballistic missile production again? By the way, that is an enormous threat that's underestimated. The enrichment, the question, or remember, it's beyond enrichment, it's weaponization. And Israel definitely hit that with its the metallurgy, the uranium conversion places into metals, from gas to metals. That they hit that in Isfahan. So will Israel be able to have freedom of action there? Will Israel, and by the way, we have to remember that Witkoff is also going to be speaking, forgetting about dealing with in Doha, he's also going to be speaking with the Iranians to try to find a final Iran nuclear deal. And so Israel's minimum is Israel has to have freedom of action. It has to be able to stop the refinancing of the proxy, stop ballistic missile production. And there's no ifs, ands, or doubts that Iran is going to want to restart its program. And many people believe that it even has now more incentive to do that. And will President Trump have restraints on Israel? You don't need American help for Israel to just mow the grass there again and again, but it can't. But just like in Lebanon now, and that's the next thing you'll hear pressure of Israel being told to remove from its 5 strategic locations in southern Lebanon. Because Hamas will be disarmed, Hezbollah will be disarmed in the north. Who's going to really make that happen? I spoke ago about ILTV could do in Lebanon, and there's a limit what they could do on Hezbollah, and there's a limit what you could do with Hamas in Gaza, because Israel does not want to remain and occupy it, and with Iran, there's going to be mowing the grass. So there is so much more complexities. This is not what President Trump wants, which is a victory dance. You can claim it, but there's still so much more work to go on, and the daylight cannot be seen in the Middle East between them. But there are other opportunities for normalization as a price for Israel to conceding more in Gaza. And those places, low-hanging fruit, could be Azerbaijan, it could be Indonesia. It doesn't necessarily need to be Saudi Arabia. So you have these other possibilities. And what will President Trump do? This is sort of a little bit of a bartering here. But I worry for the hostages there, but I also worry about Israel's security in a post-October 7th world and the Israeli people.
Right. What would President Trump do? That's always a tough question to try to answer. Dr. Eric Mandel there. Thank you for trying, though, and helping us with that. Dr. Eric Mandel, thank you for joining us on ILTV.
Thank you.